I think you'll be excited with the presentation that we're going to hear at noon. Some of you are familiar when I talk about the OneNet system. Those of us in the state have, for the most part, heard about the OneNet system. Some of you from out of state are probably familiar with what your own infrastructure is in the state. Maybe you can give us some guidance and ask some questions towards the end of the presentation. Maybe give us some feedback. But we felt like a conference of this nature, discussing teaching and learning and interconnectivity and communications, really wouldn't be complete without talking about our telecommunications infrastructure within the state. So the presenter that we have today at noon is going to address the topic of how to go about developing a statewide infrastructure for telecommunications. He's going to talk a little bit about what Oklahoma has done and maybe give us a progress report towards the end. And then he also will be on a distance learning panel this afternoon. So if you have some more questions after this session, you can go ahead and attend that session and have some more interaction then. Our presenter today is Mike Earhart. He's with the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education. His title is Management Information Services Director. His responsibilities are for the design, installation, and maintenance of the agency's computer networks and telephone service. Mike was instrumental in researching and writing the telecommunications plan for the state. He also coordinated the organization and implementation of OneNet. This is Oklahoma's gateway for NSFNet and Internet access. His background includes computer and telecommunications, including a position as Associate Director of Microcomputers and Data Communications at the University of Oklahoma Health Services Center. He's been a co-owner and vice president of a computer company, and he's also managed the installation of the National Council of Churches' first computer system. So if you'll join me in welcoming Mr. Earhart.
Thank you. As Anita said, what I'd really like to do is maybe talk very generally about the kinds of things that as a planner we look at designing a state network and trying to provide infrastructure, and then use Oklahoma and perhaps a few of the other states I'm familiar with as examples of how we can do this. Like anything, this thing is set for so long that there are some very fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself. Who do I serve? What do I serve? Who's the audience for this? So we're slowly going to get to the next slide. Okay. Is there any more volume to this? Is it better maybe if it's a little closer? Okay. The first thing is to look at design itself. General design here in Oklahoma has been one driven largely by the state. We've done so in partnership with the telecommunications industry. We certainly can't leave them out. Everyone has some combination of local telephone companies, has a combination of inter-exchange carriers. And those numbers vary widely. There are 39 local telephone companies, Southwestern Bell included, certainly being the largest here in the state. We certainly got to work with the other 38 when we look statewide at what there is to contribute. There's your cable television operator, there's wireless communications that comes into play. And so different states have done this differently. In Oklahoma, you've had the Regents for Higher Education for the last 25 years operating a wide area network around the state. Because of that experience, because of that infrastructure, it made a lot of sense as we go to modernize that network and add additional telecommunication services to leverage the infrastructure and the technicians and the investment that's been made today. Other states have taken very different approaches. If you're in North Carolina, for example, the state there, while they took state funds to subsidize the development of the network, they went to the telephone companies and primarily Bell South and GTE, and I believe there was a third party. They simply gave the money to them and said, you develop the infrastructure, we'll just pay you to go do that for us. And it made sense for them. They didn't have to develop infrastructure. They didn't necessarily have the staff in place in order to do that. So these designs range from one extreme to the other. who is the target audience? And who is it you're really trying to serve with this, both initially and in the future? One of the questions we had to ask ourselves is that for a while, OneNet's been planned, this expansion of OneNet in Oklahoma has been planned now for 2 to 3 years. And along the way, there was a TOP process where Oklahoma won a federal grant a year ago, primarily through the OSU main campus and the Oklahoma Department of Commerce. It was a planning process to look at telecommunications statewide. In that, OneNet was suddenly expanded. We needed to get involved in things like telemedicine. We needed to be involved in access by citizens to government information, maybe to renew your driver's license, maybe to be able to access your academic transcript, maybe to look at how credits you earned at a 2-year facility transfer to a 4-year facility, articulation as we call it. So there's a lot of potential audience that was there. One of the mistakes that we made, quite frankly, is that we broadened our scope to the point we were never going to get the thing built. If you try to be everything to everybody, it's just not going to happen. And so that's why I say I think you've got to say initially, what are we going to do? We recently rewrote the business plan for OneNet, and in that we said this is primarily an educational network. Its secondary use is going to be to connect all the agencies of government. And when I said that recently in some presentations, I've had a number of folks from the healthcare industry say, wait a minute, you've written us out of this. No, we haven't. But what we said is that we want this thing running in the next few months. If we're going to do that, we've simply got to limit what is going on. Certainly in the future, if this is a state network, telemedicine and rural healthcare is every bit as important as education. If you go into most small towns around the country, that's your 2 big industries. That's your 2 big employers, is the healthcare industry and the educational facility. So it's a very important issue. It's even about the survivability of many of these smaller communities. So in the future, and in order to have a really effective system, you're going to have an opportunity for everyone. You're going to have the private sector become involved in this. Private sector both in terms of telecommunications providers, as well as private sector in terms of commercial businesses. In the Lawton area, for example, there's a number of defense contractors located around the Army base for itself. On the other hand, they have been adamant that they need to get onto the state network. And the reason is that we can electronically give them a presence at Vance Air Force Base in Enid. We can give them that same presence at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. They don't have to open remote offices. On the other hand, it's in the best interest of the government. We can get better prices and better services because of the competition that will ensue. Hopefully those employers will employ more people, taxes will be raised, and so it's almost a life cycle of one economic development. So everyone's got to participate in the long term in order for this to be effective. What kind of issues do you have to face? And I think one of the hardest, particularly in a rural state like Oklahoma, is equity and access. How do you find a way so that someone who's in Idaho or someone who is in Guymon, Oklahoma is going to be able to access all of these services at more or less the same speed, at more or less the same cost as someone who's fortunate that happens to live right next to a hub site or lives in Oklahoma City or lives in Tulsa? For someone like myself, maybe it's a 10-minute drive to go to the library and there are literally thousands of books, but for people in these other communities, they simply don't have that kind of luxury. So equity and access becomes a very important issue for us. There are members of our state legislature, the Senate in particular, that like to hold up the city of Thackerville as an example. And so we talk about Thackerville schools. The point is Thackerville's a little tiny town on the Texas border, but they're representative of all the towns in all these areas. And their point is we're not going to spend a dime on a network until we know that Thackerville is taken care of. And I think that's a point well made. As I said, healthcare, the state has much of an interest in healthcare. It's a complex area, though. I mean, it's easy to say that the state can help the county and the state-ran hospitals, but that's hardly the limit of it, and you can't simply isolate those hospitals. Many of the doctors that practice there have a private practice. They're involved in clinics. They need to interact with a pharmaceutical company that's a commercial for-profit operation. So you can't draw a lot of lines around this thing. It's something that is terribly complex. And there's an appropriate role for the state. We're going to have to understand what it is. Education, that's a lot easier to define. I mean, we know the different sectors of education. We know the state has a role in all of those. And we know that that's in part the future. It's going to bring a lot of change, on the other hand. We were just talking while we were eating lunch here about the emerging role of the teacher. That's one who disseminates information to one who facilitates information. Suddenly, I'm not going to learn all the facts and figures from that instructor in the classroom. I'm going to learn how to explore and understand those facts and figures. But given that opportunity, I can do that about any discipline I choose. Services to citizens. Several years ago, we wrote a plan, a telecommunications plan for the state of Oklahoma. And I think there was some very powerful language in the very beginning of that. And something that at the time I thought profound, and I still believe in this, is how do we hold the growth of government down? I mean, how do we keep the government from constantly expanding, adding new employees to the payroll? And it's one of those things, on the other hand, as a citizen, I want those services. I want the health care. I want the public safety role to be done. I want to know that there's weather forecasting and reporting that's going on. And so the government provides that for me, and we all tend to like that. On the other hand, they'll just like paying the bill for it. So we think, and there's a number of folks that I think truly believe this, is that telecommunications is the one real potential that we've seen in the last number of years and may see for the next several years to really begin to limit the size of government, yet at the same time still allowing it to be as effective or perhaps even more effective in delivering its services to the citizens. So I think that's something government's very mindful of. The Oklahoma Tax Commission is looking at one end. They're going to have to modernize all the tag agencies. They're going to have to modernize a lot of the tax offices around the state. But they intend through this network to allow electronic filing of tax returns. They intend for you to be able to interact with the tag agent electronically from the PC or the Macintosh that you've got at home. So, and that brings us to network services. We know who that is. From the state's perspective, in the end, it's all of its citizens. What kind of services do you provide in this? Some of these, again, become a little controversial. The decisions are not so clear-cut. When we talk about offering voice services, from a state's perspective, from a state agency's perspective, that's a very obvious thing to do. If we can put our long-distance telephone conversations over a private network, we can save money. Suddenly, we don't have to pay the bill to Southwestern Bell or AT&T or MCI or whoever. And so that's a very tempting thing to do. On the other hand, if you look at these things as life cycles, if I don't pay it to that company, why do they do business in my state? Why do they invest in the infrastructure that I need to be able to do this in the first place? So as someone said, we don't really want to eat the golden goose. So voice is something that we're struggling with in the state and we don't have good answers for. Historically, what we've done with our network is we've allowed it in use of education. We've allowed it for administrative purposes in education for one campus to talk to another. But we've drawn the line when it comes to long-distance traffic students and the dorm rooms and said, let's do something else with that. So that's an area that I think particularly here we continue to struggle with. Video is one of those things that everybody's in love with, but it's not the answer to a lot of things. And so 2 to 3 years ago, all the state agencies in Oklahoma said, we've got to have teleconferencing, we've got to have video services. And what we've undergone has been a real educational process. Another story that I was talking about earlier, 2 years ago, our state board of regents got permission from the legislature. They altered a statute and allowed us to hold a board of regents meeting by telecommunications. We had several of our board mates, a 9-member board. We had several in Tulsa with staff. The remainder stayed in Oklahoma City in our boardroom where they typically meet. Well, I guess I'd probably like to sit here and tell you from a technical standpoint, I thought this thing went pretty well. We kept the camera on everybody all the time, and we kept the volume going, and nothing went black during the middle of it, so my worst nightmare never happened. What also didn't happen is, when we got done, the board's never held another one. I don't want to hold another one, frankly, for a while either. Is that we lose all the things of human communications that we want to know. And if this gentleman were to say something controversial, this board member that's sitting here, I don't necessarily want to see them. I want to see the fellow over here. I want to see their face. Are they shocked? Are they surprised? Do they know it's coming? What are the differences? And maybe I need to whisper to somebody. Maybe I need to tell them something. And how do I do it if they're 200 miles away and on a television screen? How do we walk out of the room for a minute because we want to settle a private difference away from the public and the press and then come back in and hold the remainder of the meeting? And the answers to those things aren't there right now. The technology just doesn't support that. So I think that's a good example of, it seemed like a great idea. Nobody had to drive to the meeting. We could have better attendance, but I'm not sure we had a better meeting as a result of it. And I think that the lessons you see there are the same lessons, whether we're in education or we're in business or elsewhere, that we're going to have to address as we offer these services, is that these are tools. And like any good tool, when you need it, it's absolutely the best thing in the world. When you don't, it's just a lot of dead weight. From a business's point of view, video conferencing may make a lot of sense. I think it works very well. I'm going to do something with one or two people and we need to hold a few graphs up. That kind of communication is very effective. I use this technology all the time to talk to my operations managers that are located in different buildings in Oklahoma City. So they have them drive across town. We need to have a meeting. It's still a little better than the telephone. We see each other's faces. We know who's mad, who's hurt, those kinds of things. That works pretty well. So I think that's another question we have to answer is how do we do that? And then data services. I think that's an easy answer for everybody. Everybody has a use for that right now, including a lot of the state agencies. There's some cost savings to be used with that. So again, clearly it makes a lot of sense to be able to bring data services into the network. But when you put these together, and that's the important thing, is it's not services by themselves. What kind of applications are you able to offer? How do you bring this together in education? Again, it's very easy to say, I'm going to put a camera at the front and back of the classroom. I'm going to put some TV screens around the walls. Yeah, that's great. How do they get the book out of the library? How are they able to go to the faculty member's office after hours and have a conversation with them? How do they go to the bursar's office and pay for something? I mean, you've got an entire experience that you've got to take into account. And so again, because of the combination of voice, video, and data, there are answers to that. We're slowly digitizing books and journals and materials, and so our libraries are becoming electronic. It shouldn't matter whether you're on campus or off. We're trying an experiment currently up at Northern Oklahoma College with Vance Air Force Base, and the airmen have just a little workstation that has a little tiny camera on the top of it and then the normal PC-type monitor. The same thing exists in the faculty offices over in Tomperlin at Northern Oklahoma College. And so they have electronic office hours. It's just a private teleconference. The airman comes in, sits down, says, I'm having a problem with this. The faculty member can answer it. They have a shared whiteboard application they can have on the screen. They can write electronically back and forth. There's a document camera. They can put a piece of paper under there, write on it, and send that electronically back and forth as well. So there are some answers to the technology, but I think the challenge to all of us is trying to understand what the problem completely is and finding the answers to that. Telemedicine, again, is every bit in its infancy. While there's huge promise and potential there, it's really understanding what works and what doesn't. Several months ago, Comanche County Hospital in Lawton, Oklahoma came to us and said, we'd like to use OneNet. They had a federal grant, some TOP money again, and they wanted to be able to hook up about 9 to 13 clinics and hospitals in that portion of Oklahoma. Well, one of the first things they did is they said, we're going to do some remote cardiology monitoring. I said, well, that sounds pretty good. What do you mean? Well, we're going to have some people in these beds, and we're going to put all the little probes and everything on them, and we're going to monitor it 200 miles away in Lawton, okay, on our network. I guess we need to think about reliability in a different way. I mean, it's one thing that camera goes dead in the middle of the class. The students don't seem to mind too much. It's another thing in a situation like that. So again, we've got to be careful as we proceed in this process, but again, the promise is one that we're able to deliver a quality of health care. I was very pleased yesterday. That same vice president of that hospital stood up at another meeting similar to this, and he said, you know, I want you to know OneNet has saved lives. And I was taken aback by this. This is probably something that I couldn't pay for this kind of goodwill. But the fellow said, I've got some examples. Because of OneNet, we had a young girl in the Lawton area who needed some extreme psychiatric care. We couldn't get it anywhere in the area. We were going to have to write her off. Except that we suddenly got Indian Nations Fiber to put a line across the street to Cameron University. We used OneNet on your lines to get into Oklahoma City. Southwestern Bell taught a circuit into you guys out to Baptist Hospital, and we found a psychiatrist with the appropriate discipline that's been able to help this girl and turn her around. He said, I've got another story, a young lady that was bitten by a spider. Was in very serious shape, and again used the network, found a specialist in Tulsa who was familiar with this kind of venom, was able to advise the doctors in Lawton, and was able to work on this young lady successfully. So these are the kinds of things you can do with it, and they're very powerful. As I say, but at the same time, we've got some of the same limitations. How do we whisper? How do we hold private conversations? But I think telemedicine is an emerging technology that not only is it going to provide us with a better quality of health care, again, it's going to hold the cost of health care down. We're not going to have to pay the same rates because of this. Government services, I touched on some of those. Plans to file things like your tax return and other kinds of paperwork electronically, renew your driver's license, get your car tagged electronically. All these things are in the works. This is not something that's 2 to 3 years out down the road. These are things that are going to start happening in the next 6 months or so. So we're encouraged by some of the things that we see in these agencies. They're moving very quickly to make these kinds of changes. Another thing when you design a network is existing infrastructure, what is already in place. Not only what is in place on the part of the state, but what is in place on the part of industry operating within that state. We have to think about, in Oklahoma's case, we had almost 5,000 miles of analog microwave service around the state. We've operated that for the last 20 some odd years, as I said. A lot of you have used it or heard about it as talkback television. We have in that period of time, ran thousands of students through those programs, many of them with the completion of degrees. So it's been a very useful extension of our education system. On the other hand, some of that microwave is now 20 some odd years old and only had a useful life of about 15 years to begin with. In fact, we can't even get spare parts for some of them. So we've got to do something with that. We knew we had this dilemma. On the other hand, we got fiber optics that the state owns that was installed about 8 years ago that connects the University of Oklahoma with Oklahoma State University. It stops in the middle with the University of Central Oklahoma and Langston University as well. So we had some very state-of-the-art facilities that were there, and we knew that we wanted to leverage those somehow in terms of the design of the network. Satellite services. I think a lot of you are familiar, particularly with the programs that are ran out of OSU. Some of the arts and sciences programs, the high school programs, some of the industry programs where they've targeted specific level courses directly into a business, whether it was Halliburton or Seagate Technologies or Conoco or Phillips or a number of others. And so we have to be mindful that there's a big investment both in the uplink facilities here in the state as well as the downlink facilities that a lot of you may have on campuses and beside high schools and so on. So all those things come into account as you look at the design for it. So one of our goals with OneNet was to be able to leverage all of that infrastructure that we already own. Another thing that the state has that can be very powerful is right-of-way. Right-of-way along its turnpikes, right-of-way along the interstate highway system. People that MCI, others that run these intercontinental networks just love to be able to put their fiber in that kind of right-of-way. The reason is the state doesn't tend to plow it up very often, not like a farmer in the field across the way. So for them, it's a very protected thing. Their cost of maintaining it and their risk of service outages is far less. We asked a cost accounting company recently to do a little research on this, and they said nationally the average is about $8,000 a mile for right-of-way. So for every mile of turnpike we've got in the state, for every mile of interstate we've got in the state, we've got the potential to trade that for something worth about $8,000. In fact, that just recently happened. As we're looking to expand OneNet, we asked for some bids. We want to extend the fiber that runs from Norman to Oklahoma City to Stillwater on into the Tulsa area. So we put that out. We put a clause in there and said we're willing to put up any of our turnpike right-of-way, any of our interstate right-of-way. What can we get? And we got 2 bids that were very exciting to us. The first one was a bid for someone to extend the fiber that runs from Stillwater into the Tulsa area along the Cimarron Turnpike and State Highway 51. They were willing to put in 4 strands of fiber, put in the buildings, the batteries, everything but some of the electronics necessary to make this work. What they wanted in return was some use of some fiber in buildings that the state owns that we're currently not using any. When we first put the fiber in, we put 12 strands of it. We're using 4 today. So they said, we'll give you 4 of ours, you give us 4 of yours. How about we do that for 20 years for $1? So all of us are scrambling for our billfolds. And that was the first one. The second one that came in was a consortium of long-distance companies. And they wanted a route from Joplin, Missouri, through Tulsa, through Oklahoma City, and down I-35 into Texas. They were willing to put 12 strands of fiber in for $1. They'll maintain it. They're responsible for it. And so again, everyone said, well, here, I'll put in my share of that one. So those are the kinds of opportunities. And one of the reasons I think that I want to tell you this is not only from the state perspective, but you should have the same opportunities as a city, as a community, as a county. Those kinds of creative possibilities exist. So when we talk about this in terms of the state, certainly think about it in terms of your own situation. There may be some less obvious ways of doing things, but because of that, we had about $1.5 million set aside to complete that Oklahoma City to Tulsa link. As it turns out, once we buy even the electronics necessary to make that work, we're probably only going to spend $600,000 or $800,000. So we've got the additional funds to extend the network even farther, or just to hold back as a reserve. And existing equipment, you certainly can't discount that. Some of it's proprietary, some of it is certainly got a useful life that must be extended. So that's another consideration when we talk about existing infrastructure. One of the things that we had to think about was kind of negative, and that is that we had a lot of old electronics that we kind of laughingly said, it runs about as well underwater as it does above water. And so fortunately, we've been able to replace most of that over the past year and a half, but we've been waiting on the release of some bond funds here in the state. That's just about to occur, and that's what's going to finally replace a lot of that old equipment for us. Policy. That's probably the hardest thing to deal with sometimes because it's such a nebulous thing. When I talk about policy, I take it to mean a number of things. The state statutes. What authority did the state give the regions to operate a network? What authority do we have to interact with the hospitals and telemedicine? What authority do we have to have public access to state information? What authority exists to say that private industry can participate in this, particularly if it's a state-subsidized operation? So the statutes are certainly one place that you've got to look at. And all those are issues right now that are on the table in front of us that we're trying to get the legislature to address. Beyond that, I think you've got to think about regulation. In Oklahoma, that'd be our Corporation Commission primarily. What kind of regulatory environment is there? For the state, one of the nice things is that we have what's called a hybrid network. Because we have the fiber, because we have the microwave, we are not regulated by the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. We're regulated only by the FCC. There was a court case about this a number of years ago. The judge was asked to dismiss the case because there was no bounds for trial in Oklahoma. He agreed and said if there was going to be a case, it had to be at the federal level. So I think that has given us, again, some opportunities of who we can do business with and how we can do business with. But we're fortunate in that respect. What that means is that if I want to go to the local cable operator and ask them to extend the network, I can. I don't have to go to the local telephone company. So because of that, we can put out competitive bids and we can get some prices that are far more effective than if we just had to deal in that regulated environment. On the other hand, that regulated environment affects the industry. The state of Texas, this last year, deregulated telephone industry in the state of Texas. Now, what they got for that in turn was a real windfall of money. Part of the bill, I think it was House Bill 2128 in Texas, said that the land-based telephone companies, primarily Southwestern Bell, GTE, and a handful of others, every year for the next 10 years has to pay a sum of $75 million into a special fund for the state. The cellular operators in the state of Texas also have to pay $75 million into the same fund. So they're going to have $150 million a year, $1.5 billion overall. The fund is earmarked for education, not only for infrastructure. They're going to use it to wire the classrooms. They're going to use it for staff development. They're going to use it for curriculum and materials. Huge windfall. On the other hand, you say, well, wait a minute, isn't the consumer going to pay for this? Well, you'd hope not. If you deregulate this properly, there'll be competition. They simply can't raise their rates because there's somebody else a little hungrier than they are that enters into that marketplace. So regulation is a real opportunity if it's managed correctly. And other policy. I talked about our Board of Regents and what it does over the higher ed system. And there are, of course, the governing boards over many of the campuses. There are policies on the part of state agencies, on the part of hospitals, and everyone else that's involved in this. And so in the end, it's a very complex thing. If you recall at the beginning, I mentioned there's 39 telephone companies in Oklahoma. Trying to get them in the same room at the same time is something of a miracle itself, let alone trying to get them to agree on something. So that has been a real problem, probably the same thing we all face. How do we fight our way through that? The other side of that policy is that as we look at it, again, in terms of education, one of the things we've tried to be very careful of as the regions is to say, let's not rush to make policy. This telecommunications field is evolving so rapidly. We really don't know what's going to happen in a year or 2 or 3 down the road. And for us to right now try to put a lot of rules around it, put this thing in some sort of nice box, just doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's see what kind of innovation develops out there. We have another school here in the state, Rogers College, that has a TV station broadcast over the air. It's caused some consternation on the part of a number of folks, but at the same time, we've been very reluctant to move in and try to put a lot of rules around it. We'd like to see what happens. What's the quality of the education they deliver? What kind of market does it reach? Is it very cost effective? And so those things are always important to us as well. I think the one thing we'd say is we don't want to create predatory practices. We don't want larger, more well-funded institutions to be able to use this to their advantage and at the disadvantage of the smaller schools in the state. So we would step in those kinds of situations. But again, I think that lack of policy sometimes, as this emerges, may be a blessing for us. Another issue you consider is providers. One of the things we've been very fortunate in when it comes to equipment is discounts. Because we said that the primary mission of the network initially was education, that we've been able to obtain tremendous discounts. The telephone industry has offered us DS3 circuits, very high-speed, high-capacity circuits, for rates less than $1,500 a month anywhere in the state, any distance. They're distance insensitive. Whether I run one across town or I run one for 1,000 miles doesn't make any difference. That's more than 100-fold decrease in prices over the commercial tariffs. And they wanted to do it in the name of education. They said, frankly, we're not too interested in DHS. I mean, it's nice that we can help, but we help the state agency. On the other hand, if we can all stand up and say, well, we did this in the name of education, we did it for our children, for your children, then there's some value to that. They're able to sell that to their stockholders and to the cooperative members and others. So we found that to be the real advantage. The same thing has happened as we've gone to bid routers and computers and modems and all the other components that we put into these things. We've seen the same thing. Because we did it as education, we've seen discounts of 30 to 50% on these pieces of equipment. We've been fortunate. I had one telephone company several months ago approach me and say, can we buy off of your bid? It was one of the smaller companies in the state. The kinds of discounts that we're receiving were greater than what that business can receive as an operating telephone company. So economies of scale, treating the whole state as an enterprise as opposed to treating it as a series of counties or a series of schools has made a lot of difference to us as well. Suddenly we've used some of the same kinds of tactics that a business would use to obtain better pricing. Who are the service providers and how you interact with those? Again, we've utilized most of those 39 telephone companies in providing this. We've also used a couple of cable companies, Cox and TCI. We've also used Oklahoma Gas and Electric. They needed to be able to use microwave-based systems and fiber-based systems to control a lot of the delivery of their products. They don't deliver electricity over it, but they sure control the equipment that manufactures that electricity and stores it. And so it was in their interest to modernize their network at the same time we did ours. Again, I think when you look around, there's just absolutely some creative partnerships that exist out there. And finally, capacity. I've talked about the local exchange companies, and surely they've got a lot of things in place, a lot of digital switches, a lot of fiber in the ground. The inter-exchange companies, the AT&Ts and the MCIs that operate in the state. AT&T here in Oklahoma has particularly played an aggressive role in trying to provide equipment that's manufactured by them, as well as some circuits, particularly on the longer run. The cable companies, the final delivery into the home. We're looking at some things in Oklahoma City. We have started hooking people up with Ethernet connections over the cable company in town. They're also offering what's called an FDDI connection over the cable company, as opposed to maybe the traditional delivery of cable. They're now in the business of some fairly reliable high-speed data communications. And certainly they do video very well. If we wanted to wire all of Oklahoma City's public schools tomorrow, we could just turn on a couple of switches. There's really not a lot there left for us to be done. And that's true whether that's in Okmulgee or Muskogee or a number of other places that have fairly large progressive cable operations. And then, like I mentioned, the rural electric co-ops, they're also Even though a lot of them have towers and microwave operations around the state, they have excess capacity. And often they're willing, particularly again in the name of education, but even in the name of government, to make those services available. And that brings you back to, as you've studied all these things, as you finally think you've got some grasp over them, it's time for the development of the plan for it. One of the things that we did with OneNet, some of you may have seen me at other presentations in the past, and if you have, the one thing you always saw that I had was a map of Oklahoma, had lines running all over it, and we said, here's all the new circuits we want running into these cities. And we had maybe 1 or 2 pages with that of handouts. We had some bullets that said, here's some benefits if we did this. Here's how we intend to pay for it. On the other hand, right now in hindsight, I would say that's the one reason OneNet survived. If we came out with a 100-page detailed plan in the beginning, it had been shot to pieces. Because now that we've got a 100-page detailed plan, it is being shot to pieces. The more that you reveal in the beginning, everyone thinks you've made your mind up. You box yourself into this corner, and so that's the problem. Have a general plan, because that allows you to go on and take the next obvious but important step. Develop consensus and ownership. Because all we had was the map and a couple of pieces of paper, suddenly we got the telephone companies to buy into it. They had their little piece of the action. We got education to buy into it. There was something for them. We got government to look at this thing and say, hey, there's something for us. And so we were able to take these groups that are otherwise competitive with each other, to say the least, and finally give them the kind of ownership in the plan that was necessary to move it forward. So it's only been after a couple of years of having this map around that we finally sat down, wrote the business plan, wrote the detailed technical plan, and those things are just being finalized at this point in time. I think that that is the key to a lot of things. A lot of things are very well thought through, and it's not that they're bad, but having that detail in the beginning really works against you. And so then, as I said, it becomes time along the way to build a business plan. That's been very helpful, because one of the pockets of resistance we ran into recently is, why should the state even be in this business? Why don't we just simply get MCI or AT&T or Grow or somebody to come in here and do these things for us? Yeah. And so there's a lot of companies, and some of them do this very well. But one of the things we found, we hired a cost accounting company out of Tennessee to study the one that we had. And they found that the rates that we were able to do this for, the rates we can supply circuits, the rates we can supply data and video services to our clients, is about 8 to 12% of the rates that commercial companies price these services at. In other words, our annual charge for a T1 line is about what you could expect to pay per month if you went about this thing commercially. So we had some huge economies of scale. This was big enough that we were able to achieve that same economy that a telephone company or a cable company could. But we needed a business plan, because obviously to our incoming Republican administration, their first thought is, why not privatize this? We can't be the business of the state to be in this business. But over the past few months, we've shown that very slowly, very steadily, that it is, that we're able to provide these services in a way that is absolutely cost-effective to the state, and that right now, at least, it makes the most sense to go about it the way we have. The other thing I'd say is, now that I've got this business plan, it makes all the sense in the world to make it a living document. Every week we revise it a little bit. As something changes, we hire new personnel, or we learn more about the operation of the network. We're constantly rewriting the document. You've got to stay focused on what you're doing, and that's the planning document that makes the most sense, that you can hand it to a governor, you can hand it to a senator, you can hand it to someone on the street, and it ought to make some amount of sense to all those folks. I added this slide just earlier in the day, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about funding. There's a lot of ways you can go about this. Self-sustaining. That's one of the things we've never done in the past in Oklahoma. The network that I mentioned, the one the Regents have ran for 25 years, we allowed all the schools that were connected to it to use it for free. That made a lot of sense at the time. Everybody who developed a lot of use of the network certainly didn't cost anybody anything. But now that it's worn out, nobody's willing to pay anything to keep the thing going. So it was short-sighted in that sense. So I think that is a key, is being able to charge for the use of the network, as long as those charges are effective charges. I guess by that I mean, if I had to charge more than anybody could afford to pay, that's simply not going to work. But again, as I've said in OneNet, we've had that study. We know that the prices that we're now able to offer our services for are very effective. And the state can help subsidize a network like this. That's not necessarily a popular thing to do. There are some ways to go about that, taxes, bonds, and others. That is the one thing here in the state. There was $14 million in bond money set aside 3 years ago for telecommunications. I'm very pleased to say that in the meeting last night with part of the governor's staff and Senator Robinson and Muskogee, several of the rest of us, that they're looking at the governor's schedule towards the end of next week, beginning of the following week, for what's called the contingency review board to meet. That'll be the final approval of funds for our state network and finally allow us to go forward with the construction of this network. So that was some very encouraging news indeed. For those of you who have tracked this process, the State Data Processing Committee met in May and authorized the expenditure of up to about $8 million for us to buy all the equipment necessary to modernize and expand this network, as well as the fiber optic projects. So while we had everything bid out, had those bids back in, we've had to wait on this meeting before we finally go ahead and release any of the funds. I think the other thing you've got to look at is trial projects, build some sort of a model. I think in Oklahoma, we've seen that already. We've seen some dial-in service. We've seen internet access in part of the campuses. We've seen the ability to do distance learning. So we know how these things work, what's good about them, what's not so good about them. But again, I think going slowly. Many plans sometimes come along, particularly when they're as broad scale as this. You do it all at once. Then you realize there was something wrong with it. So I think the fact that we've had this history, we've had this chance to do things on a much smaller scale, makes a lot of sense for us. You've got to be able to test things, to test concepts. We brought in folks, we brought in attorneys, and we set up simulations. We took some folks up at Stillwater and put them in a distance learning classroom, and they were criminals. Or so, and this was play acting. And they were the ones, we gave them the secret about the crime they had allegedly committed. And we took some detectives from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations. We put them in another classroom in Oklahoma City in our College of Nursing. We had them interrogate the prisoners in Stillwater and said, how does this work? Then we brought them together in the same room, had them repeat the same process. And we said, did you lose anything because you did this over TV? And the answer was, yeah, we did a little, but it wasn't bad. We could still see if they turned their head a certain way. We could still see their eyes if they contracted or their pupils expanded. We could see the sweat on them when we needed to. And so they were able to find out it was effective technology. But again, testing that to understand before we just statewide went out and built a bunch of teleconferencing centers was a very important concept for us. And then, of course, once you do all that, you're going to have to refine the plan. Even now, even at the point where we're finally ready to release the funds, we want to be able to go on and begin the construction of this. We may have one or two more equipment bids. Technology is constantly changing. So some of the things that have been in these wing-nut specifications for the last year and a half are not the state-of-the-art components they used to be. And so we're constantly looking at, well, how do we make it better? How can we do this cheaper? Because we know in the end, people have to be able to afford that. And that leads us to implementation. Finally, whether it's Oklahoma, whether it's another state, how do you go about that? You've had your pilot projects, you've got your business plan, somehow you've got your funding. And so then, and I think now appropriately so, it's time for the detailed plan. Now, as a good friend of mine would say, the devil is in the details of this network. And so what kind of an implementation plan? If you've got to order all these pieces of equipment, how do they show up in the same place at the same time? How do they get that installed? That's something we've got to work with a lot of folks about. We've got to work with this campus about what room do they want to use, where do we put the equipment. How do you go about the installation of this whole thing? How do you do the training for it? I think that that's a huge area we've all got to think about is we've got a great plan for infrastructure. I don't know that we've got a good plan for training, for staff development at this point. One of the things that I'm fond of saying is that if you don't have that, the equipment's going to grow rust. It's just not going to be used. And so I think we've got to think about how do we make sure people are comfortable with what we put in place and how do we provide support for it. One of the things in our business plan, one of the things that we're very proud of is that we're going to start the operation of a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day helpline, an 800 number, toll-free number that people can call Oklahoma City and ask questions about the network. I'm not sure if we can put enough people on it, particularly in the beginning, but it's a step in the right direction. You're going to have someone out there that you're able to communicate with. With that, that's the end of the presentation. I do have the infamous map that I talked about. Again, if someone's not familiar with this, this is the first step in our state network. What happens with OneNet? I mentioned the fiber that we already own, the existing infrastructure from Stillwater through UCO, Oklahoma City, and Norman. We have some digital microwave that's in operation that runs down into the Lawton and Alphas areas, into the Ardmore area. We're going to continue to utilize that. Blue lines are the lines, the DS3 circuits that we're going to get from the telecommunications industry. And so part of the plan of OneNet, and this is how we deal with equity and access, is trying to find all these locations around the state. The closer we can bring these high-speed services, we're going to put modems and computers and other things located at each of these green dots around the state as well. Is the closer we bring that to the population, the more effective we think that is. One of the things, we've learned a few things as we've done this, but one of those is that every city in Oklahoma with a population greater than about 6,000 people has a hub site. So we're very pleased with that. On the other hand, we've also left some folks out. And that's something we're struggling with right now. But I can assure you we're looking for answers for what to do about that last 18% of the population. This black line is actually going to be from number 1 across. It'll go from Stillwater into Tulsa. So that turned out again to be very financially viable for us to do. The speckled lines that are on here are wide area calling zones. It's something that the Corporation Commission set up through regulation, but we can take advantage of. Anybody who lives within those areas has a toll-free telephone call to any of the hub sites that are located in that area. So even though we've got a hub site here in Okmulgee, we'll have modems here in Okmulgee. If for some reason you've got a busy signal here, you can dial a telephone number in Tulsa, access the modems up there. Again, it's a local telephone call. So there's things that we can take advantage in the design of the network. I think with that, I know we're just about out of time here. I'd be glad to take 1 or 2 quick questions, and if not, I think we probably need to let you all get headed for your next session. Bottom line question is when. And I guess I started to get at that by saying the CRB has been one thing we've needed. With those funds released, it's going to take about 180 days to construct the fiber from Stillwater to Tulsa. The companies that bid that said they're going to do the green lines, the DS3 circuits that go everywhere, the bulk of those are scheduled for operation by December the 31st. All of the remainder of them will be in operation by March the 31st. So for everything that I'm talking about, April of next year, with a lot of it in place by December of this year. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so it is minus some things. All right, with that, I guess I thank you.
What's the line service hub site? Is that DS3?
The line service for the hub sites is DS3. That's capable of handling up to 4 full motion video circuits, up to 8 compressed video circuits, all of those simultaneously, so that'd be 12 video circuits altogether, and then still have about 2 T1 lines for internet type access that go into that. All right, thanks, and I'll see you.
Okay, one last thing, if you all would help us fill out the evaluation forms, not just on this session, but on the overall conference. Jeff, can I ask you to stand back and pick up evaluation forms? We're going to move back over to the Noble Center. We're pretty much on time, so if we can get started in about 15 minutes with the next session, then we'll get you out of here on time today. Thank you.